Good morning, everybody. Today is the 24th of October. You're tuning into the Drake Martinez podcast, and I'm your host. Today, we're going to be talking about the deep state, also known as the Illuminati, the shadow government, and we're going to be talking about who are they? What is their goal? What kind of people are in this group? Are they even real? And much, much more. Okay, so I kind of go back and forth on this. I have gone back and forth on this for many, many years. I was first introduced to this idea of a deep state, a shadow government, a puppet masters behind the strings of politicians during the. It's interestingly enough, the first time I was introduced to this idea was during the gameplay of Metal Gear Solid 2, and I believe the game was called Sons of Liberty. I got introduced to the game from a friend. I went over for like a birthday party or something like that. I must have been in either like high school or late elementary school, maybe 7th or 8th grade, maybe 9th grade, somewhere around there. I think the game came out in like 2000. Like I don't do this podcast with like my phone or Google or anything to assist me, so I just do it like from memory. I think that's important to do, to exercise your memory. In any event, the game came out. I got exposed to it from some friends at a birthday party, and I was like, wow, it's a cool game. So I bought it. I believe, on PlayStation 2. And I start playing the game, and you get to a point in the video game, for those of you who haven't played, or maybe for those of you who've played it, don't really remember, you play as this guy named Raiden, and Raiden is a super soldier. He's on a mission to save, I believe it's the vice president. The vice president has been taken hostage by a group of like terrorists. I don't remember what they're called, but they're like these like other like supernatural like terrorists, but they actually have like real supernatural abilities as opposed to the main character, the protagonist, who is a super soldier, just Navy SEAL type of guy. And throughout the game, you're collecting intel, you're conducting espionage, trying to infiltrate the kind of like offshore like oil facility. I believe it was like an oil rig that the vice president is being held at. And as you go throughout the mission, you find you eventually do meet the vice president, and he tells the main character that there's a lot more than meets the eye at this operation, that he is a puppet, and he and the president are both figureheads. They're puppets to a group called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty are the real, or I believe he calls them the Patriots. I don't really remember. I'm pretty sure he calls them the Patriots. And these guys are the real people that are leading the world, that they are the ones that are making the policy decisions, and whatever song that they're playing, every other politician around the world dances to, especially in the United States. And I remember thinking to myself as a young kid that I wouldn't be surprised if this is really how the world is, that the president is a puppet, that the vice president's a puppet. They're all puppets, and they're dancing to the song that's being played by somebody else. There were some other ancillary things that were happening at the time that made me also realize that. I wouldn't say, or maybe it was a couple of years later, was when I realized that most of the music, the popular music at the time, from artists like Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Mandy Moore, kind of like bands, boy bands, etc., all these major pop artists at the time all had their songs written by the same 3 or 4, maybe like half a dozen or so, usually Scandinavian songwriters. And nobody knew their names, but these guys were the biggest songwriters in world history, making a ton of money off of these artists that they were writing songs for. And then I was like, well, what kind of industry is this? Like, especially growing up as a musician, that I had been playing music since I was a little kid, like probably like 9 or 10 years old, playing guitar, bass guitar, stuff like that. And I said, like, what kind of industry is this that like these handful of guys are writing all the popular music that is played on the airwaves, that is played on the radio, that's getting the attention, that's getting pushed and promoted. And who are these artists that they're just like, hey, you look like the perfect person to, to sing these songs, and here you go. And who builds this like brand recognition for these artists for them? Because someone's doing it for them. And how does this happen? Like, how is it that it's not like a band like Blink 182 where they come up through the ranks, so to speak? They write their own crappy songs, and then those crappy songs turn into better songs, and then they start playing at better venues, and then they go on a tour, and then they get recognition through that like organic grassroots like kind of method. And once they get to a point of like notoriety, then it kind of makes sense that they get onto the national stage and international stage, and people from all around the world know their music. That was, I thought, like the organic way. I was always wondering, like, how do artists like Britney Spears do it? How do artists like Christina Aguilera do it? Like, how do they just like explode onto the scene? Well, the answer is that they get groomed, and they get groomed by an industry. And this industry then tells them this is what you have to do in order to be the face that we want you to be. And we have these songwriters, we have these producers who are going to make the best music for you and really highlight your talents. And we have the best audio engineers that are going to be able to mix and master the music in a certain way that really highlights who we want you to be. And some of them may have some influence in terms of like how they write lyrics, or maybe writing a song or two, or being part of the process. An example might be like Katy Perry. Like she's definitely part of that process from what I've seen from some of her songs. Not trying to get too off track on the music analogy, but there is a precedent there, for some artists that do have like some of that kind of influence. But like again, they're these are a handful of artists in an ocean of artists that could be picked, and there's plenty of other more talented artists that could be picked that aren't. And why is that? I always wondered. And then I was like, well, that kind of makes sense also for this like political arena, that there's probably people behind the scenes that are influencing this and influencing this process and grooming the people that they want, bringing them into the fold and telling them, this is the agenda, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to say. Do not go off script. If you do, we'll pull you, bring somebody else in. And we recently saw that with Joe Biden, right? Like he wanted to run, made it very clear that he wanted to run. And he got his funding pulled from him. He got his support pulled from him from within his party. And without the party, he couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. So we all know what happened with that. Kamala came in. So going back to this topic of like, who is the shadow government? Who is this deep state? And what do they want? Well, I think that they have 2 tiers to them. And I think that the deep state and the shadow government are 2 different things. The deep state, I think, is, and I don't really have any evidence for this other than just being a student of history, analyzing how presidents, presidential administrations have gone about in the past. What kind of people pop in and out of cabinets? What sort of influence do they have, and what sort of introduction did they have? Because all that really plays a role into like figuring out like who these people are, what do they want. And a lot of them actually just tell you. A lot of them tell you in like these writings, these obscure books that they write that only people in the in that arena read. But let's kind of break it down. I think that there's two tiers to this. There's the deep state, which is its own thing, and then the shadow government, which is another thing. And I think within the shadow government, you have 2 different aspects of it. So let's analyze the deep state. The deep state became popular and a popular term during the Trump administration because Trump himself was saying like, there's a deep state, and this deep state is behind the scenes influencing things and making things happen in a certain way that is contrary to what the president wants, and they're sort of like negating his will, and therefore the will of the people that voted for him, which is the democratically elected representative of the republic, the constitutional republic that is the United States. So he's like, yeah, there's this deep state. What does he mean by a deep state? Well, he means that there is an unelected bureaucratic state that is at some or multiple levels able to put their hands on the levers of power of government in such a way that they don't respond to the president of the United States. Is that the same as a collusion? Kind of. Is this collusion like a directive? Like, are they getting these directives from like an organization that says like, hey, you have to do it a certain way, you have to do this a certain way? Yes and no. Yes and no. I think a lot of it is just like a hive mentality that you see this a lot. Like, and I think a really great book that illustrates this point is 1984, where it doesn't really take a whole lot. And you've seen that, and everybody saw this during COVID. There wasn't like a directive that said like, you must enforce your neighbors to wear a mask. You must do that. It's just like a sort of like this thing that just came natural for a lot of people. Not everybody, but for a lot of people. I would assume for not everybody on this, or most of the people rather that listen to this podcast. But for most people out there, if you went out in public and you weren't wearing your mask, people would give you that look and be like, hey, what are you doing, bro? Like, put on that mask. I don't want to be around you. Or if people weren't social distancing properly, they'd be like, excuse me, mind stepping back? Those guidelines were there, but there wasn't like a directive that said like, you as an individual citizen have to help enforce these. It just sort of came naturally. Again, that's another reason why like Japan is such a orderly country. There's social pressure that is influenced from other people that says, hey, you're supposed to hold the doors open, you're supposed to be orderly, you're supposed to walk on the side of the street. And if anybody out there's been to Japan, it's a very orderly, very clean, very quiet place. And it's very, very beautiful. But that orderliness comes from a sense of social pressure. So in some sense, this is a directive of social pressure, not necessarily a command that's coming from the top in a structure, an organizational structure. That these are some people within the federal government, different agencies, different departments that more or less just follow the liberal agenda. And they follow it because that's what MSNBC told them to say. That's what like CNN tells them. And furthermore, that is what their colleagues are doing. So in order to fit in with their colleagues, in order to fit in like with who the people, their peers and the people with whom they work around, they adopt these policies as well. And I've seen a lot of that in the government, because I work in the government. And, for example, you see people who are like, I don't want to celebrate LGBT stuff. I don't want to go do Pride Day and go cut this cake or do this or that. And, they'll get shunned for it. They'll be like, oh, you don't support Pride Day? Like, what's wrong with you? Or Pride Month? You don't believe that people are equal, blah, blah, blah. And like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I don't go by that. I go by what Jesus says. And then people will like shun that person, and then they lose out on a promotion. And, everybody out there can picture that pressure. You've all probably experienced it in your jobs. You've all probably experienced that at some point or another. And it's the same thing that permeates workplaces, because these government agencies at the end of the day are offices and they're workplaces, and people have that workplace mentality within the workplace. Like, you want to get promoted, you want to get more money, you want to be able to get along with your colleagues. So a lot of people just go along to get along, right? Now, there's also a sort of element to it that I think a lot of people don't really appreciate, which is that on that side of the aisle, the left, if they speak out or if they attacked the administration, Donald Trump's administration at the time, they were lauded as heroes. Now, I'm in the military, and there was this guy, I think Vindman, like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I think was his name, or I don't remember what rank he was, but he was trying to aspire to a rank. He kept saying that the Trump administration just destroyed his career, and he had to retire as like a rank that he was lesser than. And he was trying to aspire to a rank. I think it was colonel. I think he was lieutenant colonel. But in any event, I'm pretty sure it was lieutenant colonel. So he's aspiring to become a colonel, and he's like, well, yeah, this all happened. Trump ruined my career. The left lauded him and his, his like whistleblower, if you will, like attitude, or his like coming forward, and they lauded him as somebody who's a legitimate whistleblower. Sorry, and someone that deserves to be called a hero. But if we go back to just in recent history, there was a guy of a similar rank who was criticizing the American withdrawal in Afghanistan, and he was thrown in prison for his comments. So on the one hand, you have on the left, you have who, for whatever reason, the media, social pressures, etc., that if they lean that way and they do certain things, they're lauded as heroes. Things that they're technically not supposed to do, right? They're not supposed to say those things about the commander in chief while they're in uniform and while they're, doing certain things. But he got thrown in prison. I'm sorry, he didn't get thrown in prison. He got put on trial, or he was speaking. He wasn't even like put on trial. I think that he was like just like speaking as like a witness or whatever. He was just. On the other hand, you have a person who does a similar thing, and that guy is thrown in prison because of his political leanings, or his statements weren't even really political. They were just like criticisms of how this officer thought a Marine Corps officer was thought that the government was handling the Afghanistan withdrawal, and two very different outcomes. And this other guy, Vindman, he's still lauded as a hero. He's on Twitter. X all day, and he gets, money from his posts. He gets tons of attention. I mean, even his wife is like a prominent figure on X, and the Marine Corps officer that got thrown in prison is not. No one even really remembers his name. I don't remember his name, but I know they got thrown in prison for speaking his mind. So again, is that a symptom of a deep state? Kind of, yeah. I mean, did it come from a directive? Maybe, maybe not. But that social pressure is a real thing. I do think that on another tier of even within the deep state, that there are cabals of people that conspire. But the evidence of such a thing is not really anything that I could speak of. But what I can speak of is operating within the government, operating within military, that social pressure is still there. It's there. And people on different sides of the political spectrum are treated differently for doing very similar things. I think we all know that. So is that we can talk about what is that? How does that come about? How is it that we have such different treatment for the same, the same actions, if you will? How is it that Vindman is lauded as a hero, but Snowden, who revealed real things that the government was doing that was illegal, at the very least, I shouldn't say illegal, maybe at the very least unethical, probably illegal, I don't really know, but at the very least unethical. How is it that I'm pretty sure they're not allowed to spy on Americans, but in any event, he's a political prisoner in exile. I know that he released a lot of things that like people weren't too happy about or like jeopardized national security or whatever. I'm not advocating what he did, but he's a legitimate whistleblower. And I don't know. I think there's some certain things that I don't really like about him personally, but I'm just pointing out that there's very different treatments for different types of whistleblowers depending on what they, um, not just depending on what they reveal, but depending on like who is harmed by the information that they reveal, and not necessarily their political leanings. Does this suggest that there is a shadow government? It kind of does actually. It Now I think about it some more. It kind of does. It suggests that at the very least that social pressure is coming from somewhere, that the social pressure is being amplified by the media. And I think the media is for sure part of this shadow government at the definitely at the very tops of who is setting that policy. And there's no mistaking that, because they have all these videos that you can see of like they clearly get a script. They're like, you scream, I scream, we all scream for ice cream. I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen that video, but if you ever look up just like media uniformity or something like that effect, like uniformity in the media reporting, you'll ice cream. You'll probably find that video of just like different like NBC or ABC affiliates from all different cities around America, getting this script and they say it verbatim. So there's no question that there's a directive that comes from the media that tells people, their anchors, what they can report on, how they can report on it, what exactly they're supposed to say. This influences the populace. The populace then reinforces it in a social pressure sort of hive mind mentality manner. But there's also, I think, directives that come from with the top of government agencies that are aimed at a certain way. Now, within the federal government of the United States, I think a lot of that is social pressure. Rank and file people I'm talking about that's social pressure. Hey everyone, so sorry, my daughter was crying, so I had to go get her. She's with me now. Say hello, Olive. And she's 6 months old, or she's about to be 7 months now in a couple of days. And she was crying, so I had to go get her. Her mom's over at the gym. But anyways, the rank and file create like this system of social pressure that is just normal. It's just like any other government agency or any other like private sector business that that creates that creates that social pressure. If so, I keep saying it over and over again, but so we'll move on. Now, on the policy side, you do have these people that are like that have undue influence for reasons that aren't essentially clear. Some of them are clear, then some of them aren't. Some of the people that come to mind for this in this category are people like Dick Cheney, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger. A couple of those guys are dead. Dick Cheney's still alive, but Dick Cheney just didn't pop his head up during the Bush administration. He also came up during the Ford administration. And the Ford administration was replete with like disasters because it was a leftover of Nixon, and Nixon got pushed out for reasons that resemble a coup d'etat. And all these things sort of like point to a shadow government that is pushing people in and out and putting their people in and putting incompetent or at least compliant people, sometimes both, into the government to do their bidding. And their bidding over the years has taken on different forms. Now, we have to kind of answer this question of, is this policy directed from a consortium of individuals that are creating a cabal At that level, I would say that it's more appropriate to assume that that's the case. Why? And it's not just because, and it's for multiple reasons. It's not just because that the policies, as we can now see, affect different countries in similar ways and are all being driven in different countries in an unnatural way, which would suggest that this is coming from a directive. But it's also mirroring what's happening in local and national education institutions. So earlier, I think in yesterday's episode, I was talking about, yeah, babe. I was talking about like MIT, Harvard, these northeastern, specifically in the Boston area in Cambridge, which is a neighboring city of Boston, that these colleges and these universities are pushing agendas that later on, sometimes 3 to 4 or 5, 6 years later, then become adopted into mainstream society. Yeah, it's her. And a lot of these policies that start off as theories come from a consortium of college professors that also kind of like round table become policy advisors in the United States government. I'll give you an example. Hillary Clinton is a great example, but there's an even better example before her, which I'll get to in a minute. Hillary Clinton, when she was defeated in the 2016 election, and right back to as a faculty member, I'm pretty sure it was at Yale or at Harvard that she was teaching diplomacy there or something like that. She might have only taken like one class, but these policies also come around, that these policies that are directed, these policies that are advocated, come around in NGOs and think tanks. And it's sort of like this revolving door of government official, NGO representatives, think tank representatives, and then college professors, faculty members that are continuously swinging around that make this policy full circle. And that policy then permeates and becomes part of the norm. Just like the most clear example will be open borders. That open borders was pushed all around the same time, right in time for a refugee crisis. And if you think about the timing of that this open border policy became advocated and pushed right before a refugee crisis during the Syrian civil war that our government, the United States government, had a hand in creating, not just from the Iraq war, but also from how we were arming and taking sides, not just in Benghazi, which was an operation to move those arms from Benghazi, Gaddafi's stronghold in Libya, and moving it into the Syrian civil war. That like almost every facet of the crisis was appears to be manufactured, appears to be directed. And the Western response is not one of pressuring local governments to take in refugees, but the mass importation of refugees, most of whom were unvetted at the time, and that bled over into a decade later. This problem started in 2012. We're now in 2024, and this mass invasion has been going on for more than a decade, which initiated from a civil war. Yeah. It initiated from a civil war and has now gone into just economic refugee status. People seeking refugee status for economic reasons, not due to a war. So that gave it its cover. The policy then became for all of the Western countries, not just some, but all of the Western countries, to accept the refugees in mass and to not question it. If they were, and if they did question it, they were racist. It's almost like the population was primed via the media, via education circles, to accept the refugees beforehand. All of this would suggest that there is a directive, that there is a reason behind all of this. All right. Well, I think I'll leave it with that for today. I think I'll talk more about this topic tomorrow or the next day, depending on how my schedule works out. As you guys can see, I got my hands full with this little girl, and she's awesome. I would highly recommend having children if you guys are out there like on the fence about it. It's amazing to have a baby and have a little person, just hang around with you and do all sorts of fun stuff together. But I think we'll talk more about this because it all kind of just like hit me as I was talking about it, that the evidence isn't really so much of like something that we can like point to like their minutes on like notes that they have from their meetings, but more from the fact that they prime us for the crisis that happens before it happens, and then prime us for the response that we have in order that is antithetical to our survival. That it would make sense on the survival level to say, hey, we want to vet these people, especially if you're looking at what happened with the Syrian civil war. I mean, what's happening now is just like so outrageous that like, it's not even worth really discussing. What's more interesting is what happened in 2012 with the Syrian civil war, because it was very clear at the time, this is just major, mainstream news was reporting this, that ISIS had taken over at the time the city of, it wasn't Aleppo, it was someplace else. It might have been Aleppo. I'd have to look at the map. But you can look up ISIS takes over passport printing press, and you'll find articles that illustrate how it was Raqqa. Just from memory, it was Raqqa, R-A-Q-A or R-A-Q-Q-A, Raqqa, Syria, eastern part of Syria. That the first thing that they did once they moved in from Iraq into Syria was they had taken over Raqqa, the whole city. That they not only had started a passport printing press where they were giving their fighters passports, but they also started creating Syrian passports to be able to go into the West during the refugee crisis and infiltrate countries like Germany and France that experience huge terrorist attacks. Notice that those terrorist attacks stopped after Trump became president also. That there was like if you remember, there were like almost terrorist attacks every month in cities like in countries like the UK, France, Germany, which had taken in a lot of those refugees, and some of whom were terrorists. So, and even if it was like 1% of like of a 1 million group that came in, that's like 10,000 terrorists. That's like 10 cells, or maybe even 1,000 cells, depending on how they, split up how they do their manning. But we'll talk more about this. I think all of this suggests that there is a shadow government that is dictating, and my daughter agrees that there's a shadow government that is, behind the scenes on all of this. And I think that's the shadow government that the deep state was more of what I was talking about earlier. All right, she needs some attention. I'll let you guys think about this, and I'm going to think about it some more going into the next episode. Love you guys, and we'll see you, and we'll talk next time. This is Drake from the Drake Martinez Podcast signing out. Bye-bye.